The squad cars arrived with their sirens wailing, red and blue lights painting Detective Marcus Johnson's suburban driveway like a crime scene. 3 patrol units for one man and his dog, as if the Labrador retriever sleeping peacefully in the afternoon shade posed the same threat as an armed fugitive. Marcus stood in his doorway, still wearing the plain clothes from his shift at the precinct, watching as officers he didn't recognize stepped out of their vehicles with the cautious movements of responders expecting trouble. His heart sank as he realized what was happening. The complaint had finally escalated to this moment, the moment when his neighbor's months-long campaign against him would force brother officers to choose sides in a battle he'd never wanted to fight. Behind the police cars, Margaret Whitmore emerged from her pristine colonial home like a prosecutor approaching the bench. At 72, she moved with the rigid precision of someone who had spent decades believing that rules existed to be enforced and neighbors existed to be controlled. As the self-appointed HOA enforcement chair, she had made Marcus's life a systematic nightmare for the past 8 months. "Officers!" she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Thank you for responding so quickly. That animal has been terrorizing our community for months." Marcus looked down at Duke, his 5-year-old chocolate lab, who was watching the proceedings with the patient confusion of a dog who had never done anything more aggressive than steal food from unattended plates. The terrorizing that Margaret referenced consisted of Duke playing fetch in Marcus's own backyard, barking at the occasional squirrel, and once, just once, escaping his yard to investigate a neighbor's barbecue. For this, Margaret had filed 17 separate complaints with the HOA, demanding fines, restrictions, and ultimately Duke's removal from the neighborhood. "Ma'am," Officer Bradley said, consulting his notepad, "we received a report about an aggressive animal and public disturbance. What exactly has this dog done?" Margaret's eyes lit up with the fervor of someone finally given an audience for her grievances. "Where do I begin?" "Excessive barking at all hours, running loose through the neighborhood, menacing children at the playground. This man has no control over that animal, and it's become a public safety issue." Each accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because they represented a calculated campaign of character assassination that had slowly isolated him from a community where he had hoped to build a life after years of service in some of the city's most dangerous precincts. The excessive barking occurred during normal daytime hours when Duke played in the backyard. The running loose had happened once when a gate latch failed during a storm. The menacing children incident was actually Duke approaching a group of kids who had been calling to him through the fence, his tail wagging with the excitement of potential new friends. But Margaret Whitmore dealt in perception, not truth, and her version of events had been repeated so often throughout Oakwood Estates that it had taken on the weight of established fact. "Officer," Marcus said quietly, "I'd like to address these allegations." Officer Bradley looked between Marcus and Margaret, clearly uncomfortable with the domestic nature of the call. "Sir, are you the dog's owner?" "I am, and I can provide documentation that Duke is fully licensed, vaccinated, and has never shown aggressive behavior toward any person or animal." Margaret's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Documentation, officer, I have 17 separate incident reports filed with the HOA. This man's dog is a menace, and if the police don't act, someone is going to get hurt." The implication was clear. Marcus was an irresponsible owner whose dangerous animal posed a threat to the safety of law-abiding citizens. It was a narrative that had been carefully constructed over months of HOA meetings, neighborhood discussions, and social media posts that painted Marcus as the outsider who refused to follow community standards. What made the situation even more painful was that Marcus recognized the dynamic. He'd seen it in his policy. Work, the way certain complaints were taken more seriously than others, the way some residents' concerns carried more weight than others' rights, the way justice could be skewed by assumptions about who belonged and who didn't. But what Margaret Whitmore and the responding officers didn't know was that Marcus Johnson wasn't just another suburban resident facing HOA harassment. He wasn't just a dog owner trying to live peacefully in his chosen community. He was a 15-year veteran of the police force, a decorated detective who had served with distinction in every precinct in the city, and someone whose badge carried the respect of every officer who had ever worked with him. A fact that was about to transform this moment of humiliation into something entirely different and infinitely more powerful. The path to this confrontation had been paved with 8 months of escalating harassment that Marcus had endured with the patience of someone who understood how systems could be weaponized against the innocent. It had started with subtle complaints about Duke's presence in the community, evolved into demands for behavioral restrictions, and finally crystallized into Margaret Whitmore's crusade to have the dog removed entirely. Marcus had moved to Oakwood Estates 18 months earlier, drawn by the quiet suburban streets and the promise of a peaceful home where he could decompress from the stress of detective work. After 15 years of investigating homicides, domestic violence, and gang activity, he had earned the right to a yard where his dog could play safely and neighbors who might actually wave when he pulled into his driveway. But the welcome wagon had never arrived. Instead, Marcus had been greeted with sideways glances, whispered conversations that stopped when he approached, and the gradual realization that his presence in the upscale neighborhood was viewed as an intrusion rather than an addition. The complaints about Duke had started almost immediately, but Marcus recognized them for what they really were, pretexts for a deeper discomfort with his presence. Margaret Whitmore had emerged as the leader of the opposition, using her position as HOA enforcement chair to systematize what might otherwise have remained as isolated prejudice. Her weapons were regulations, fines, and the kind of bureaucratic harassment that could make life unbearable without ever crossing the line into obviously illegal discrimination. The first complaint had been about Duke's barking during quiet hours, which Margaret had unilaterally defined as any time before 9 a.m. or after 6 p.m. Never mind that city noise ordinances allowed normal pet sounds during daylight hours, or that Duke's barking was minimal and always in response to specific stimuli. The second complaint focused on Duke's presence in the community park, claiming that unleashed dogs posed a safety hazard to children. Marcus had provided documentation that Duke was always leashed and had never shown aggressive behavior, but Margaret had pushed for a complete ban on dogs in common areas. By the 6th month, the complaints had become increasingly creative. Duke's presence in Marcus's front yard allegedly reduced property values. His occasional barking disrupted Margaret's afternoon tea. His friendly approach to other walkers constituted menacing behavior that made residents feel unsafe. Each complaint triggered HOA meetings, fines, and increasingly restrictive conditions on Duke's activities. Marcus found himself documenting his dog's every movement, providing veterinary records of Duke's temperament evaluations, and ultimately confining a social, energetic animal to his backyard to avoid further conflict. But the restrictions weren't enough for Margaret Whitmore. "That dog represents everything wrong with how this community is changing," she had declared during the most recent HOA meeting, her words carrying implications that went far beyond animal behavior. "We have standards here, traditions that need to be preserved. Some people seem to think they can just move in and ignore how we've always done things." Marcus had sat in the back of the community center, listening to his neighbors debate his right to own a pet as if he weren't present. The experience had been surreal, a decorated police detective being lectured about responsible citizenship by people who had never put their lives on the line for public safety. The breaking point had come 3 days earlier, when Duke had escaped through a gate that maintenance workers had left unlatched. The dog had wandered exactly 2 houses down the street, where he had been found playing with the Thompson children in their backyard, tail wagging, utterly harmless, having the kind of innocent fun that dogs were supposed to have. But Margaret had witnessed the incident and immediately called it in as a vicious animal attack in progress. The 911 call had been a masterpiece of manipulation. "There's a large dog running loose through the neighborhood," she had reported breathlessly. "It's approaching children at the playground. I can see people running for safety." None of it was true, but the call had generated an official report that Margaret had submitted to the HOA as evidence of Duke's escalating aggressive behavior. The board had voted to impose a final ultimatum: remove the dog or face legal action for violation of community covenants. Marcus had spent 15 years in law enforcement, long enough to recognize a setup when he saw one. The complaints, the escalating demands, the final ultimatum. It was a textbook campaign, designed to force him out of the community through legal harassment. But what hurt most wasn't the injustice. Marcus had seen plenty of that in his career. What hurt was the isolation, the way neighbors he had tried to befriend had sided with Margaret's version of events, rather than getting to know him and Duke personally. The Hendersons, whose mail he had collected during their vacation, now crossed the street when they saw him walking Duke. The Patels, whose car he had jump-started during a winter storm, avoided eye contact when he waved. The young families he had hoped to get to know had absorbed Margaret's narrative and treated him like a threat rather than a neighbor. Now, standing in his driveway while police officers responded to Margaret's latest complaint, Marcus felt the weight of every stereotype he had fought against during his career. Here he was, a decorated law enforcement officer, being treated like a criminal because a neighbor had decided his presence was unacceptable. Officer Bradley was taking notes while Margaret recounted her litany of complaints. "This animal has been a problem since day one," she was saying. "The owner shows no respect for community standards, no willingness to control his pet, and frankly, no understanding of how a neighborhood like this operates." The coded language was unmistakable to Marcus, who had heard similar phrasing in dozens of police reports over the years. Community standards. How a neighborhood like this operates. Shows no respect. Each phrase carried implications that went far beyond dog ownership. Officer Martinez, who had been examining Duke, looked up with confusion. "Ma'am, this appears to be a very well-behaved animal. He's not showing any signs of aggression or stress." "Of course he's calm now," Margaret snapped. "But you weren't here when he was terrorizing the Thompson children. You didn't see him running wild through the streets." Marcus watched the officers processing the disconnect between Margaret's dramatic accusations and Duke's obviously gentle temperament. These were experienced cops who had dealt with genuinely dangerous animals. They knew the difference between a threat and a pet. But they were also responding to an official complaint from a resident who spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed by authority figures. "Sir," Officer Bradley said, turning to Marcus, "we're going to need to see some documentation. Dog license, vaccination records, any training certificates." Marcus nodded and headed toward his house to retrieve the paperwork. As he walked to his front door, he caught Margaret's satisfied expression, the look of someone who believed victory was finally within reach. What she didn't understand was that she was about to discover exactly who she had been harassing for the past 8 months, and that revelation was going to change everything. Marcus returned from his house carrying not just Duke's documentation, but something else that would transform the entire dynamic of the confrontation. In his left hand were the vaccination records and licensing papers that Officer Bradley had requested. In his right hand was the leather wallet that contained his police credentials. 15 years of service, multiple commendations, and the gold shield that marked him, as a detective in the same department that employed the officers who had responded to Margaret's call. But he hesitated before revealing his identity, remembering the complexity that came with being both a police officer and a citizen, the way badge status could complicate situations that should be resolved on their merits alone. Marcus had always believed that right and wrong shouldn't depend on who held the authority, and part of him wanted to handle this conflict as Marcus Johnson the resident, not Detective Johnson the cop. That decision was taken out of his hands when Officer Martinez's radio crackled with a familiar voice. "Unit 47, this is dispatch. We have a priority call for Detective Johnson at 1247 Maple Street, requested for immediate consultation on the Riverside homicide case." The address was Marcus's home. The coincidence was unmistakable. Officer Martinez looked up from his radio, confusion evident on his face. "Excuse me, sir, but are you Detective Marcus Johnson?" The question hung in the air like a revelation waiting to unfold. Margaret Whitmore's confident expression faltered as she registered the title that had just been spoken. Detective, not just any resident, but a law enforcement officer. Marcus sighed and opened his wallet, displaying the badge and credentials that identified him as a 15-year veteran of the police department. "Yes, Officer Martinez, I'm Detective Johnson, 3rd Precinct Investigations." The transformation was immediate and electric. Both officers straightened to attention, their entire demeanor shifting from routine complaint response to the respectful deference accorded to a senior colleague. "Detective Johnson," Officer Bradley said, his voice taking on the formal tone of a subordinate addressing a superior. "Sir, we had no idea. If we had known—" "You would have responded exactly the same way," Marcus interrupted gently. "A citizen complaint deserves professional investigation regardless of who's involved." But the revelation had shattered Margaret Whitmore's narrative completely. The man she had been portraying as an irresponsible resident who disrespected community standards was actually a decorated police detective. The outsider she had been trying to drive away was someone who had dedicated his career to protecting the very community she claimed to represent. "This is impossible," Margaret stammered, her voice rising in pitch as she struggled to process the information. "You're not... You can't be. I know all the important people in this neighborhood." Officer Martinez was reviewing his notes with new understanding. "Ma'am, you filed a complaint alleging that Detective Johnson was unable to control his dog and posed a threat to community safety." The absurdity of the situation was becoming clear to everyone present. Margaret had spent 8 months filing complaints against a law enforcement officer, using the police department itself as a weapon against one of their own detectives. But Marcus wasn't interested in embarrassing Margaret or leveraging his badge for personal benefit. What he wanted was justice, not just for himself, but for every resident who had ever been targeted by systems that could be manipulated by people with time, influence, and prejudice. "Officers," Marcus said quietly, "I want to be clear about something. My profession doesn't make me more deserving of fair treatment than any other resident. What matters is whether Mrs. Whitmore's complaints have any basis in fact." He gestured toward Duke, who had remained calmly seated throughout the entire confrontation. "This dog has never bitten anyone, never shown aggression toward children, and has caused exactly one legitimate incident: escaping through an unlatched gate to play with neighborhood kids." Officer Bradley was flipping through his notebook, comparing Margaret's dramatic allegations with the evidence before him. "Ma'am, you reported a vicious animal attack in progress 3 days ago, but according to the follow-up report, the dog was found playing peacefully with children who showed no signs of distress or fear." Margaret's face was flushing red as she realized how her months of complaints looked when subjected to professional police scrutiny. "That dog is still a menace," she insisted. but her voice lacked the confidence she had displayed moments earlier. "Mrs. Whitmore," Officer Martinez said, his tone becoming more formal, "filing false police reports is a misdemeanor offense. Calling 911 with exaggerated or fabricated claims diverts resources from genuine emergencies." The legal implications were sinking in. Margaret had been so focused on using official channels to harass Marcus that she hadn't considered how her actions might be viewed by the very officials she was trying to manipulate. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Officer Bradley's radio C rackled again. "Unit 47, please advise Detective Johnson that Captain Rodriguez wants to speak with him about the complaint pattern at his residence. She's reviewed the call logs and has some concerns about potential harassment." Marcus closed his eyes, realizing that his captain had been monitoring the situation. In police departments, patterns of complaints against officers' personal residences were tracked as potential security or harassment issues. His superiors had been watching Margaret's campaign without his knowledge. "Detective," Officer Martinez said quietly, "Captain Rodriguez is en route. She wants to discuss this matter with you personally." Margaret Whitmore stood frozen in the center of what had become her worst nightmare. The man she had been trying to drive from the neighborhood was not only a police detective, but apparently one with enough standing that a captain was personally responding to investigate harassment against him. The power dynamic that had sustained her 8-month campaign had reversed completely. Instead of authority figures responding to her complaints, they were arriving to investigate her behavior. But what she still didn't understand was that Marcus Johnson's reputation within the police department extended far beyond his badge, and that the officers arriving to handle this situation knew exactly who they were dealing with. Captain Maria Rodriguez arrived in an unmarked sedan, stepping out with the purposeful stride of a commander who had reviewed the situation thoroughly and come prepared to address it definitively. At 55, she carried 2 decades of command experience and a reputation for protecting her officers from both criminal threats and bureaucratic harassment. Her presence immediately elevated the confrontation from a neighborhood dispute to an official investigation. The patrol officers straightened to attention as she approached, while Margaret Whitmore seemed to shrink under the weight of actual authority rather than the borrowed influence she had wielded through HOA procedures. "Detective Johnson," Captain Rodriguez said, extending her hand with professional warmth. "I'm sorry it took this long for us to intervene. The pattern of complaints against your residents raised flags that should have been addressed months ago." She turned to face Margaret with the direct gaze of someone accustomed to cutting through deception. "Mrs. Whitmore, I presume, I've reviewed your 17 separate complaints to our dispatch system regarding Detective Johnson and his dog." Margaret attempted to regain her footing. "Captain, I'm glad you're here. This situation has been disrupting our entire community. That animal has never bitten anyone, never caused property damage, and according to animal control records, has never exhibited aggressive behavior," Captain Rodriguez interrupted. "What's interesting is that your complaints show a clear pattern of escalation designed to create the appearance of ongoing problems where none actually exist." She pulled out a tablet and began reading from official records. Complaint 1, barking during legal hours. Complaint 5, walking in designated areas. Complaint 12, aggressive posture while playing fetch in a private yard. "Mrs. Whitmore, these aren't legitimate public safety concerns, they're harassment." Marcus watched as his captain systematically dismantled months of accusations with the precision of someone who had dealt with similar situations before. But he also saw something else in her approach. This wasn't just about defending him personally, but about addressing a broader pattern of abuse that could affect other residents. Furthermore, Captain Rodriguez continued, Detective Johnson is a 15-year veteran with exemplary service records. He's received commendations for community engagement, de-escalation techniques, and building bridges between law enforcement and civilian populations. The idea that he's a disruptive influence in any community is not just false, it's absurd. Officer Martinez had been taking notes throughout the conversation. "Captain, should we be filing charges for filing false reports?" Margaret's face went white as the legal implications became clear. "False reports? I never lied about anything. That dog has been a problem since—" "Mrs. Whitmore," Captain Rodriguez said firmly, "you called 911 3 days ago, claiming a vicious animal attack in progress. You reported children running in fear from a dangerous dog. The responding officers found a Labrador retriever playing peacefully with kids who were laughing and trying to pet him. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a deliberately false emergency report." The crowd of neighbors that had gathered to watch the confrontation was growing, drawn by the unusual sight of multiple police vehicles and a captain's personal attention. Marcus recognized faces from around the neighborhood, some curious, others concerned, a few showing the first signs of understanding that the situation might not be what they had been told. "Detective Johnson," Captain Rodriguez said, "I want you to know that this pattern of harassment has been noted in your file as a potential security concern. Any future complaint, NTS from this address, will be reviewed by our domestic terrorism unit to determine if you're being targeted because of your law enforcement status." The words domestic terrorism unit hit the gathered crowd like a thunderbolt. What Margaret had presented as legitimate community concerns was being investigated as potential criminal harassment of a police officer. But Marcus stepped forward, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent years de-escalating confrontations. "Captain, with respect, I don't want Mrs. Whitmore prosecuted. What I want is for this community to understand something important." He turned to address the neighbors who had gathered, his voice carrying clearly across the suburban street. "For 8 months I've been harassed not because my dog was dangerous, but because someone decided I didn't belong in this neighborhood. Mrs. Whitmore used official systems, the HOA, the police department, emergency services, as weapons to make my life unbearable." The crowd was listening intently now, seeing the situation from a perspective that had been hidden by months of one-sided complaints. "I'm a police detective," Marcus continued. "I have resources, training and colleagues who can help me fight back against this kind of harassment. But what about residents who don't have those advantages? What about families who can't afford lawyers or don't understand their rights? How many people have been driven from communities like this because someone decided they didn't fit?" Margaret tried to interrupt, but Captain Rodriguez held up a hand for silence. "Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus said, turning to face her directly, "you spent 8 months trying to destroy my life and Duke's peace because you didn't want us here. You weaponized bureaucracy, emergency services, and community sentiment against a neighbor who never did anything except try to live quietly with his dog." His voice grew stronger, carrying the passion of someone who had finally found the words he had been searching for throughout months of patient endurance. "But here's what you didn't count on. You didn't count on the fact that truth eventually surfaces. You didn't count on professional law enforcement officers being able to distinguish between real problems and manufactured complaints. And you didn't count on the possibility that your victim might have the resources and knowledge to fight back." The gathered neighbors were seeing Margaret Whitmore, their HOA enforcement chair, their champion of community standards, in an entirely new light. The confident authority figure who had led their meetings and organized their complaints was now standing silently while a police captain discussed potential criminal charges against her. "Detective Johnson," Captain Rodriguez said, "what outcome are you seeking here?" Marcus looked around at his neighbors, at the community he had hope. To call home, at the dog who had done nothing wrong, except trust in human kindness. "I want accountability," he said simply. "I want Mrs. Whitmore to understand that actions have consequences, and I want this community to decide what kind of place it wants to be." The moment had arrived for a reckoning that would determine not just Marcus and Duke's future, but the character of Oakwood Estates itself. 6 months later, Marcus Johnson stood in his backyard watching Duke play fetch with 3 neighborhood children whose parents had become genuine friends rather than suspicious neighbors. The transformation of Oakwood Estates hadn't happened overnight, but it had been thorough and lasting. Margaret Whitmore had resigned from the HOA board 2 weeks after the confrontation, citing health concerns that fooled no one who had witnessed her public humiliation. She had avoided criminal charges by agreeing to community service and attending conflict resolution counseling, but her influence in the neighborhood had evaporated completely. More importantly, the incident had sparked a broader conversation about community governance and the ways that official systems could be manipulated to target unwelcome residents. The HOA had implemented new procedures requiring evidence-based complaints, community mediation before official action, and oversight to prevent harassment campaigns disguised as rule enforcement. Captain Rodriguez had used the case as a training example for officers, illustrating how complaint patterns could reveal harassment rather than legitimate problems. The police department had developed new protocols for recognizing when emergency services were being weaponized against residents, particularly those from marginalized communities. But the most meaningful changes were visible in the daily life of the neighborhood itself. The Thompson children, whose parents had initially avoided Marcus based on Margaret's warnings, now considered Duke their unofficial neighborhood mascot. They walked him when Marcus worked late shifts, helped with grooming after muddy adventures, and had learned responsibility through caring for an animal who gave them unconditional love in return. The community park, where Margaret had tried to ban dogs entirely, now hosted monthly paws and people gatherings where neighbors brought their pets for socialization and families connected over shared love of animals. Duke had become the unofficial host of these events, greeting newcomers with tail wags and gentle enthusiasm that broke down barriers more effectively than any formal welcome committee. Mrs. Henderson, who had once crossed streets to avoid Marcus, now brought Duke homemade treats and asked about his favorite toys. The Patels had invited Marcus to their son's graduation party, where Duke had charmed elderly relatives who had never owned pets, but left convinced that dogs were excellent judges of character. The young professional couple who had moved into Margaret's former house had introduced themselves by bringing Duke a new toy and asking Marcus about the best local veterinarian. They represented the kind of neighbors Marcus had hoped to have from the beginning, people who saw diversity as strength rather than threat. Marcus's reputation within the police department had only grown stronger through the incident. Other officers facing similar harassment had reached out for advice, and his experience had led to the development of resources for law enforcement personnel dealing with residential discrimination. He had become an unofficial advocate for colleagues navigating the complex intersection of their professional and personal lives, but perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus himself. The months of harassment had tested his faith in community, justice, and the possibility of belonging. The resolution had restored not just his peace of mind, but his belief that truth and patience could overcome prejudice and manipulation. On this particular evening, as he watched Duke play with children whose laughter filled the suburban air, Marcus reflected on the lesson that had emerged from his ordeal. Power, whether wielded through HOA authority, emergency services, or social pressure, was only as legitimate as the purposes for which it was used. When authority became a weapon against the innocent, it ultimately destroyed itself. The badge that had saved Marcus from Margaret's harassment campaign wasn't just a symbol of law enforcement, it was a reminder that true authority came from service, not dominance. From protecting the vulnerable rather than persecuting them, from building community rather than enforcing exclusion. As the sun set over Oakwood Estates, casting golden light across yards where neighbors of all backgrounds had learned to coexist peacefully, Marcus called Duke inside for dinner. The dog bounded across the grass with the joy of an animal who had never doubted that he belonged, followed by 3 children who had learned that prejudice was a choice rather than an instinct. In his kitchen, Marcus hung his badge on the same hook where Duke's leash waited for tomorrow's adventure. Both symbols of service, both reminders that the best communities were built not on exclusion and fear, but on the radical idea that everyone, human and canine alike, deserved a place to call home. Outside his window, the neighborhood settled into evening quiet, but it was the peaceful silence of contentment rather than the suspicious stillness of division. Duke's tail thumped against the kitchen floor as Marcus prepared their dinner, a sound as reliable as justice and twice as comforting.